Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment and ask that you check me out on Patreon at www.patreon.com/CanadaEHX. There are several tiers with great benefits, from ad-free content to t-shirts and other cool stuff. And if you're a fan of Canadian History X, make sure you check out my other shows, From John to Justin and Canada, A Yearly Journey. And don't forget, you can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com. It helps keep this show going. All right, on with the show. What is the longest walk you've ever embarked on? Maybe 20 kilometers? Have you ever walked across your city? Let me go a step further, pun intended. Have you ever walked not just to the next town, but the next province? I have. In July 2024, I walked across the Alexander Bridge from Ottawa, Ontario to Gatineau, Quebec. It was only half a kilometer, but it counts. But how many have journeyed across the entire country on foot or other methods other than a vehicle or plane? We know of Rick Hansen and Terry Fox, but before them, there were 5 individuals who started walking in an impromptu race that gripped the nation. I'm Craig Baird, this is Canadian History X, and today we are wearing out our shoes as we learn about the Halifax Herald coast-to-coast race of 1921. Before we take a step, see what I did there? Let's get one thing straight. Canada is a big country. From Halifax to Vancouver, it's about 4,200 kilometers. South America is closer to Africa. North America is closer to Europe, and Australia is closer to Antarctica than Halifax is to Victoria. You could walk from Portugal's Atlantic coast to Moscow and still have a few hundred kilometers to spare. So yeah, Canada is big, and walking across it is no easy feat. Beresford Greathead, also known as Greathead, was one of the first people in post-Confederation Canada to do it. In 1895, 2 clubs in Vancouver sponsored a walk around the world. The winner would receive $50,000, a small fortune at the time. The only stipulation was that the journey had to be completed within 5 years, and many came forward, but Greathead was selected. He was a good choice. He was 39 years old, 6 foot tall, and weighed a solid 260 pounds. He could speak 4 languages and was in excellent shape. He set off across Canada with no money, just the clothes on his back, a satchel with a notebook, and a rifle with some ammunition. That was it. As soon as he set off, he averaged 35 kilometers a day, and it would take him an entire year to walk from Vancouver to Halifax. To survive in unpopulated areas, he hunted using his rifle, and when he had to, he just slept on the bare ground. Once he reached Halifax, he was off to Europe to continue his walk around the world. And sadly, he walks out of our story. He did return to Canada and claimed he did the full walk, including being arrested in China and going through 19 pairs of boots. I don't know if he ever got the $50,000 though. For our next cross-country walk though, we have to fast forward 2 decades. In 1921, Canada was still recovering from the First World War. It had been 4 years since the guns had fallen silent and the soldiers returned home. But then the Spanish flu hit, killing 50,000 Canadians. Almost every family was impacted by either war or illness, or both. Halifax itself was still recovering from the worst event in its history when a 2.9 kiloton explosion in Halifax Harbor left 2,000 dead and 9,000 injured. You can learn more about that in my episode about the Halifax explosion from early 2024. So Canada in 1921 was looking for something inspirational and uplifting, and also a bit of a distraction. Enter Charles Berkman and Sid Carr. Charles Berkman was 20 years old. In early January 1921, he had just lost his job at the shipyards in Halifax. He had worked there for a year because during the war the shipyards were booming, but after the war ended, the business dried up. Like Bergman, Sid Carr was also young and unemployed, and with no prospects in Halifax, they decided to look for work elsewhere. We don't know who suggested Vancouver, but as a result, both men decided to walk there to try their luck in the booming economy of the Pacific Coast. To make money, they would sell postcards featuring photographs of their travels at 10 cents each. The Halifax Herald, looking for stories to brighten up the doom and gloom of the early 1920s recession, jumped on board at that suggestion of regular dispatches from their adventure. On January 15, 1921, the Halifax Herald announced Bergman and Carr were going to walk across the country. While they wanted to walk faster than Grady did 20 years earlier, they were in no hurry and planned to take 7 months to make the journey, averaging 28 kilometers per day. Winter would be a challenge, slowing them down to no more than 21 kilometers per day, but they can make up time through the flat prairies. Since no road existed across the country, their plan was to walk mostly along the Canadian rail system, with a brief foray into Maine in the United States. On January 17, 1921, the two men were given a letter by John Parker, mayor of Halifax, to be hand-delivered to Robert Gale, mayor of Vancouver, and then they departed from Halifax City Hall, heading west as a large crowd cheered them on. An unnamed admirer begged to join them, but they refused. This walk was just for the two of them, and eventually the wannabe interloper faded away and sat down on a stone to wave goodbye. As the men completed the first 21 kilometers to Windsor Junction, they heard cries of "Here they come" from a crowd ready to greet them. That night, they were treated to dinner and given a spare bed to sleep in from a family who requested to be anonymous in their dispatches back to Halifax. 2.5 days later, the two friends reached their first 100-kilometer milestone as they walked into Truro, Nova Scotia. Bergman and Carr were given free meals and a room at a hotel. The Stanfield Underwear Company also provided the men with a pair of long johns. This proved to be very fortunate and timely because, as they set off the next day, the temperature hovered at around minus 12 degrees Celsius with heavy snow. They were undeterred. Things were going well, and for the next 5 days and 157 kilometers, the men continued their journey west. But then, on January 22nd, they received the news that would change everything. Their walk was about to become a race. Because of their dispatches, people in Halifax were transfixed by Bergman and Carr's efforts, especially Jack and Clifford Behan, a father and son team who, like Bergman and Carr, were unemployed. Both had served in the First World War, where Jack rose to the rank of sergeant and his son Clifford was wounded 3 times. Father and son thought if those other guys could walk across the country, surely they could too. So Jack Behan went to the Dartmouth Commercial Club to ask for help, and wanting to outdo their rivals across the bay, the organization gave the pair boots and a backpack for their journey. Next, they went to I.W. Vidido, the mayor of Dartmouth, who provided them with a letter for their journey. With everything in place, the father and son team went to the Halifax Herald and told them they were going to make the same journey as the other two men, but they would do it faster. For the newspaper, this was perfect. Everyone was interested in the walk by Bergman and Carr, but with these two, it would be a race. Jack Behan said, "We're out to overtake Bergman and Carr, and I'm convinced we will do so before they reach Montreal." When Bergman heard about the father and son team from Dartmouth, he said, "Well, you can tell the people backing them that no one will overtake us between Amherst and Vancouver unless we break a leg." On January 25th, Jack and Clifford Behan walked out of the Dartmouth City Hall, ready to overtake Bergman and Carr, who were 137 kilometers north in Amherst. Bergman and Carr knew they had to speed up, and on that day they walked 43 kilometers despite a snowstorm as they entered Moncton. The father and son team were 8 days behind them, but they were making fewer stops and after only 2 days had gained a few kilometers on the frontrunners. But all of this was a bit too much for Carr. He wanted a simple walk, and when it became a race, the fun was gone. He later stated it had sapped his joy for the walk. Bergman and Carr made it to Moncton, relaxed in the city, and only added a few kilometers that day. But by now, they were getting on each other's nerves. Bergman wanted to stay ahead of the Behans, but Carr just wanted to walk. He wasn't interested in the competition. Meanwhile, the Behans were 180 kilometers behind them, and they were having the time of their lives. Jack Behan said, This hiking is great fun. I had no idea the kind of stuff that boy of mine is made of. And just when things seemed like they couldn't get any more interesting, they did, when a third team entered the race. On the same day that Jack Behan boasted about how well things were going, Frank and Jenny Dill walked into the Halifax Herald's office and announced that they were going to join the race. The Halifax Herald readily agreed to publish their reports from the road. Frank and Jenny Dill were a husband and wife team from Dartmouth that had been married since 1919. While Frank was a gifted runner in his youth in Windsor, Nova Scotia, he would have never joined the race if not for Jenny. Born to a fishing family, she spent her youth hunting, camping, and enjoying the outdoors. She was also a good hockey player and was called the fastest skater in the Maritimes. After reading the reports from the road, Jenny decided that if those guys could do the cross-country walk, she could as well. As the song from Annie Get Your Gun goes, anything you can do, I can do better. I can do anything better than you. So Jenny was sure she could walk across the country and do it faster than all of them. Frank may have not been completely on board with the adventure, but he loved his wife, and he knew that once she put her mind to something, well, there was little stopping her. Jenny said, "It was I who suggested the trip. We have both worked hard since we were married, and now we're going to see the world. We have no home ties, not a chick nor a child." Frank's mother would be cheering them on from home, and he made sure to call her on a regular basis. While the Dills prepared, the leading team of Berkman and Carr crumbled. On January 28th, Carr announced he was no longer happy. He said, "I won't be forced into racing anyone across Canada." Carr hopped on a train and returned to Halifax while Berkman continued alone. By month's end, Charles Berkman had covered 479 kilometers while the Behans walked 254. They were still well behind, but they'd been able to narrow the gap by 37 kilometers. On February 1st, 2 weeks after Berkman and Carr and nearly a week after Jack and Clifford Behan entered the race, the Dills walked out of Halifax on their journey west. 2,000 people gathered outside the Halifax Herald office to cheer them on. They were slowed down by heavy snow but gained speed in an effort to catch the three men in front of them. The Dills were the fan favorites thanks to Jenny, who never wasted an opportunity to state that anything a man could do, a woman could do just as well. Women came out in droves, and when they entered Truro, 1,200 people were waiting for them, and they sold 220 postcards. And like the other walkers, the Dills also received long underwear from Stanfield. That same day, Berkman walked into Maine after completing a hard 32 kilometers in heavy snow. Despite the good pace, the Behans gained another 9 kilometers on him. Maine would be the only time the racers entered the United States because it was easier to cross through northern Maine to get to Quebec than go north through New Brunswick to walk along the coast until a railroad bridge could be found. Meanwhile, the Dills were doing their best to make up time, but throngs of admirers were slowing them down. At one small town, people stopped them to give them gifts and food. Frank was also becoming a sex symbol, and when the couple passed Mount Allison University in Sackville, New Brunswick, a large crowd of young women ran out to greet Frank. Jenny wrote, "I hope we don't pass any more girl college towns on this hike." Some questioned whether a woman would be able to walk as far as a man. Jenny wrote, "Tomorrow we will at least go as far as Moncton, 20 miles away, and perhaps if Frank can stand it, I'll take him further." Jenny, it seemed, was racing against men and sexism. Meanwhile, Berkman was not only racing but gaining popularity as well. He became the lone hiker, and many sided with him after his partner abandoned him. In Danforth, Maine, a local pastor ushered his congregation out of the church as Berkman passed by and urged them to buy postcards from him to help him in his journey. The Halifax Herald wrote, "The fact he has plugged along alone has won him a legion of friends." Some worried about his safety in the coming wilds of northern Ontario, and he received advice to carry a gun so he could shoot any wolves that tried to attack him. And just as Berkman crossed into Quebec on February 9th, the Behans walked into Maine. Berkman averaged 34.6 kilometers a day, while the Behans were at 37 kilometers and gaining. The Dills, still hounded by fans and crowds, only managed 28 kilometers a day. There was no chance the Behans would catch Berkman before he reached Montreal now, though. He reached Sherbrooke, Quebec on February 15th, having walked over 1,000 kilometers, and was quickly closing in on Montreal, while the Behans were still a bit behind him. He wrote, "I laugh when I think of the boast Jack Behan made about catching me before I joined Montreal. Already I can smell Old Craig Street and hear the feet of the French girls skipping along St. Lawrence, Maine." While Berkman was in Quebec, The Behans were still in Maine, and the Dills were just entering St. John, New Brunswick. As they approached, a police officer thought they were vagrants. He walked up to them, put his hand on Jenny's shoulder, stating, "This one can come with me." Frank responded that it was his wife, and when Jenny turned around, the police officer immediately recognized her from the newspaper. He then escorted the couple into St. John, where 1,000 people were waiting for them. A Canadian National Railroad engineer even wrote a song about her. It goes, "And if your Frank gets weary and talks of turning back, give him a dose of Neveline or a bottle of Taniac. Paint his spine with iodine, put hemlock oil on too, but keep on going, Jenny, whatever else you do." Meanwhile, at the head of the race, Berkman reached Montreal a month and 2 days after leaving Halifax on February 19th, and by now he had gone through 16 pairs of boots while trying to find a pair that fit him well. All the boots he wore had given him blisters, which he also blamed on his socks. Optimistic, he said, the worst part was over. He was wrong. As Berkman entered Montreal, he was greeted as a conquering hero. The Montreal Herald wrote, "As with head thrown back and chest out, he marched through the streets, he was a notable figure. Youth and energy vibrated from him." That night, he was given a room at the ritzy Windsor Hotel, and he danced the night with his admirers. Like Frank Dill, he was becoming a sex symbol, and in Montreal, he received a stack of letters from admirers in Halifax. As Berkman danced and fueled a future hangover that would cost him a day of walking, the Behans walked into Sherbrooke, Quebec, and 156 kilometers east, the Dills reached Maine. In Maine, Frank and Jenny were forced to walk through waist-deep snow, and it was also so cold that while sleeping in a comforter, frost formed on top of them. In another incident, while walking on the tracks on a downhill section, they had to jump off to avoid a train that suddenly appeared behind them. They averaged 25 kilometers a day in New Brunswick, but were only making 17 to 20 kilometers a day in Maine. After Berkman recovered from his epic hangover, he began the 200-kilometer walk west to Ottawa. He hoped to take a shortcut and gain a day, but lost his way, allowing the Behans to catch up just a little bit more. Now, they were only 4 days behind him. When they reached Montreal, they were given cigars and new boots, but unlike Berkman, did not spend much time there. They had Berkman in their sights, and they could taste the lead. Berkman reached Ottawa and spent a full day greeting dignitaries. Prime Minister Arthur Meehan signed his logbook. He also met F.B. McCurdy, the Minister of Public Works, who was from Halifax, and the two played a game of pool. Ottawa would be a high point for Berkman because his time as leader was shortly coming to a close, as the other teams were fast approaching. Like George Costanza, the Behans liked making good time. On February 28th, they walked 56 kilometers in 1 day, more than double what Berkman walked that same day. Jack Behan wrote, "We know we are closing the gap on Berkman and can almost hear him pant as he leads us in the race." By the end of February, Berkman had covered 1,490 kilometers in 42 days, the Behans had 1,382 kilometers in 34 days, and the Dills had 928 kilometers in 27 days. Hoping to stay ahead, Berkman hoped to walk 85 kilometers in 1 day to Pembroke, Ontario. His feet were filled with blisters, and he instead walked 51 kilometers to Chalk River. When people told him the Behans were catching up, he said he was going to hold the lead. Walking into northern Ontario and afraid of being attacked by a pack of wolves, Berkman bought a gun and then lost an entire day in North Bay while waiting for it to be repaired, while he was also buying, yet again, new boots. The Dills, meanwhile, walked into Montreal, where they celebrated their second wedding anniversary on March 10th. They didn't rest on their laurels and instead walked straight through. Far ahead of them, the Behans were now only 1 day behind Berkman. In Halifax, a man put down a $1,000 bet that the Behans would finally overtake Berkman by March 12th. That would be about $16,000 today and was no small bet at the time either. On March 11th, the Behans were only 14 kilometers behind Berkman, and they would have caught him. But Berkman had figured out an ingenious solution to walk on the railroad track. He took a long stick and attached a roller skate on the other end, which allowed him to balance on one rail, while the roller skate was on the other rail, making him gain speed, but it would not quite be enough. On March 12th, Berkman decided it was more important to visit old friends in Sudbury, which cost him half a day, as the Behans closed in. But that man in Halifax, he lost his bet. Because after his visit with friends, Berkman reached Chelmsford that night and asked a telegraph operator to wire back to Azilda, the station between Sudbury and Chelmsford, to see if the Behans were staying the night. The Behans told the telegraph operator they were going to stop in Azilda for the night, and Berkman remained in Chelmsford and then went to sleep with the competition, well, at least believing they were safely behind him. What he didn't know was that the Behans had lied and were walking through the night. They reached the community and slept in the hotel in the room directly next to Berkman. The owner of the hotel woke Berkman at 2 a.m. to tell him his competition was literally sleeping next door. Berkman got up quickly and went out into the darkness to continue his walk. The Behans left their room in hot pursuit. At dawn, 8 kilometers away from Larchwood, the Behans caught up to him. The men exchanged greetings and congratulated each other on the race so far. They walked off together in the growing morning light and for the rest of the day until they reached Cartier. The Behans and Berkman appeared to be happy, and then 550 kilometers east, the Dills reached Ottawa that same day, also happy to have crossed into Ontario. The Dills met with Prime Minister Arthur Meehan and Opposition Leader William Lyon Mackenzie King. Jenny called the walk into Ottawa the best day of the race so far. Now walking together, the Behans and Berkman traded the lead, and for several days they were even until Berkman pulled ahead on March 18th by fooling the Behans like a week earlier. The Behans expected that Berkman was going to sleep at Woman River, Ontario because it was late. Instead, he kept walking and slept in the camp of a railroad gang. Meanwhile, the Behans asked for directions and were led astray. It cost them 2 days and allowed Berkman to extend his lead. The Behans were furious and believed that Berkman was behind the ruse. A few hundred kilometers behind them, Jenny and Frank Dill made their way through northern Ontario when a wolf suddenly jumped out in front of them. Before Frank could even react, Jenny pulled out a revolver and killed the wolf with one shot. She wrote, "I was by no means excited." Jenny was instead stone cold and still behind the Behans, who finally caught Berkman in White River. Berkman had refused to wire the Halifax Herald so he could keep his whereabouts secret. 2 days later, Berkman attempted to fool the Behans again by slipping into the night as he walked in a minus 25 degrees Celsius weather. But he heard Jack Behan behind him. They were not going to be fooled again. The next day, the Behans left before Berkman and arrived first at Lake Superior. And while at a watering station on its shores, a train pulled up, and out walked the 9th Duke of Devonshire, Victor Christensen William Cavendish, the Governor General of Canada. He signed their logbook and gave them a silver basket full of fruit. He then left on a train, and the duo continued on. Meanwhile, Berkman continued to withhold updates, believing telegraph operators were leaking information to the Behans. Berkman said, "Jack Behan is pretty chummy with some of the folks up this way. I know that every day he arrived at a telegraph office, he would try and locate me." On March 31st, a terrible blizzard enveloped them, and the Behans were advised not to continue, but they heard a rumor that Berkman had passed them. This was not true, but they had no way of knowing it. The father and son walked out into the storm and covered 25 kilometers. At one point, they crawled across a long trestle 18 kilometers above the ground as wind and snow swirled around them. The Behans had no idea where Berkman was and had expected to pass him during the day. In fact, no one knew where Berkman was. He had appeared to have simply vanished. On April 1st, the Dills had one of their best days as they covered 56 kilometers. But at mark 45, Frank Dill began to falter as Jenny pushed him to complete the final 11 kilometers that day. The next day, the Behans walked into Cavers, Ontario, on the north shore of Lake Superior, to pick up mail at the post office. As they looked through their mail, Berkman walked in and slapped them on the back. He had covered an incredible 62 kilometers to catch them. And for the next few days, the men walked together and were happy to have company, as wolves seemed to always be on their heels. One night, while in an empty cabin, they heard wolves howling outside the door. On April 6th, the trio entered Port Arthur, now known as Thunder Bay, where hundreds of people were at the train station to greet Berkman, their hometown hero. His parents were also on hand. It had been a long time since Berkman had seen his family, and he decided at that moment there were more important things in life than winning a race. Berkman spent 2 days with his parents, while the Behans took the lead for good. He said, "I promised them that at home, and I shall keep my promise. I had hoped, though, when I made that promise, to have at least 7 or 8 days on the Behans, and since I have not, there is no use to cry over spilt milk." While the Behans and Berkman marched from Lake Superior, the Dills were approaching the Great Lake and Woman River, Ontario. Throughout the previous few weeks, Jenny Dill had written in her dispatches about her admiration for Charles Berkman. She wrote, "We are hoping that Charlie wins. We only wish we had as many friends along the route as this boy has." Berkman and Jenny Dill also began to exchange letters along the way, and Frank Dill became jealous. Jenny wrote, "The other day I got a letter from Charlie Berkman, and then today I got another one. I told Frank he was silly, but he said it looks fishy to him." When asked about a possible growing romance between the two walking rivals, Berkman shot things down immediately, stating, "He need have no fear of me. I did write twice to encourage her along, as I think she is the pluckiest woman in Canada. However, I am not waiting for any woman." After the 2-day race, Berkman left his hometown as the Behans reached Savannah, Ontario, the halfway point of the race. They were 2,978 kilometers from Halifax, and Berkman again went silent, as many believed he was making up ground by taking shortcuts in an area he knew well. In truth, he had fallen on a slippery rail and injured his hip. It took him 8 days to make the 247-kilometer journey to Ignace, Ontario from Port Arthur. During that stretch, he still somehow covered 30 kilometers a day. Sadly, the same distance was covered by the Behans in half the time. Meanwhile, the Dills reached Cavers on April 13th, where they lost time getting their boots repaired, and while they waited, they were entertained at a party until it was time to leave. As they walked towards Gurney, 17 kilometers away, a group of women motored on ahead and cooked a meal outdoors for the Dills to enjoy when they arrived. 3 days later, the Dills reached Port Arthur, where they realized they were closing the gap on Berkman. In the lead, the Behans reached Winnipeg 4 days later, where they put their feet in the Red River and relaxed while Berkman reached Kenora, Ontario, and was now 208 kilometers behind the father and son team. Berkman was also injured, and the joy had left him as he had little chance of catching the Behans now. His morale was low, and the Halifax Herald reports became even more sporadic, as he didn't want anyone to know just how far behind he had fallen. The Behans spent 2 days in Winnipeg visiting with army friends, as Berkman remained at least a week behind as he entered Kenora, and the Dills on his heels only 137 kilometers behind him in Dryden, Ontario. Jenny Dill wrote, "It is the Behans who are trying to catch. I feel sorry for Berkman, who has been traveling in hard luck of late." At the beginning of May, the weather warmed and the snowstorms of Ontario were long gone. All three teams would enjoy the flat land of the prairies and would make excellent time. Berkman, though, was still plagued by blisters on his feet, and his pace slowed as the Dills sped up. On May 9th, the Dills reached Whitewood, Manitoba, where a telephone operator told them they were only 32 kilometers behind Berkman. Rather than try and stay ahead, Berkman sat down and waited for them. His feet were raw from the walking, and for 2 weeks he'd been barely able to walk because of the pain. The Dills passed Berkman on May 10th when they covered 82 kilometers to Indian Head, Saskatchewan. Now ahead of Berkman, the Dills, and specifically Jenny, had the Behans in their sight. Knowing that Jenny Dill was going to push hard to catch them, the Behans did their best to stay ahead. When they reached Medicine Hat on May 17th, the Dills were gaining 16 to 20 kilometers per day. 5 days later, on May 22nd, Jenny and Frank were only 99 kilometers from the lead, and Jenny had no intentions of slowing down. She wrote in a dispatch on May 23rd, "Race well in hand. Few will ever know what the struggle meant to me, although I feel fine. Frank will never forgive me for the manner in which I have made him walk. When he wanted rest, I want to keep going, and while I do not think that Frank is a quitter, I pride myself with the thought that I have kept him going." But Jenny knew there was trouble ahead as they approached Calgary, because Frank Dill had many friends in the city and he wanted to stay and visit. The Behans walked into Calgary on May 24th, and the Dills were only 2 days behind. On May 25th at 7 a.m., the Behans left the city and walked 64 kilometers towards the Rocky Mountains. The next day at 2 a.m., the Dills arrived in Calgary, having covered 83 kilometers. Jenny wrote, "This has been the longest hike we have made. Frank would have been quite willing to stop at the 40-mile mark, but I said, 'No, Frank, I am hungry to win the race. Jenny was tired, but knew the race would soon be over and she could rest in Halifax. Until then, she would press on even if it meant dragging Frank along with her. And while she was able to keep Frank from stopping in Calgary for long, the couple lost half a day and only walked 16 kilometers. And Jenny was not pleased. She wrote, "I told him not to stay more than 10 minutes and he stayed almost that many hours, and we practically lost the entire day." As Frank lived it up with his friends, the Behan walked into Banff, having suffered from nosebleeds the entire day due to the altitude. The Dills walked into Banff the next day as the Behan slept 56 kilometers west outside in Lake Louise. Jenny could taste victory, and there was little Frank could do to stop her. On May 30th, the Behans arrived in Field, British Columbia in the morning, and the Dills arrived in the afternoon. They were gaining on them as Berkman lagged behind, only entering the Rocky Mountains, but appearing to be the happiest he'd been in weeks. No longer trying to win, he could just take his time and enjoy a walk. He sent in a dispatch on May 30th. "Some, I suppose, will criticize me for letting a woman pass me, but few know what I have done since I left Halifax. It has been a hard, long, lonesome grind, and many times I have felt different if I had company, but I decided to stick and stick I will until I reach Vancouver." On June 1st, the Behans were walking towards Revelstoke when Clifford suddenly felt a massive spasm shoot through his back. He told his father to go on without him, and he would take the train. Instead, Jack ran 32 kilometers ahead to Revelstoke, found a bed for his son at the YMCA, and got a doctor who diagnosed him with a cold in the back muscle. Sleeping outside on the platform in Lake Louise caused the back problem, and Clifford recovered after a few hours in bed. To ensure a fair race, Clifford Behan took the midnight train back to Albert Canyon and then walked back to Revelstoke through the dawn of June 2nd, retracing the steps his father had already made. Now nearing the end of the race, the Dills and Behans pushed like never before. They were covering at least 50 kilometers a day to reach Vancouver. On June 4th, the Behans walked without sleep into Kamloops to stay ahead. 4 days later, the Dills had narrowed the gap to just 1 day. Jack Behan wrote in a dispatch, "The trip is wearing us both down." Berkman was also making up time and walked 79 kilometers in 1 day on June 9th to reach Kamloops. After resting for a few hours, he continued on. The Behans were now only 98 kilometers from Vancouver on June 10th, and after resting during the day, they set off in the evening and walked for the next 22 hours straight to reach their destination. The next day at 2:30 p.m., they walked into Vancouver as an immense crowd greeted them. The Behans were the first on June 11th, and the Dills were only 97 kilometers behind them. In her dispatch, Jenny did not congratulate the Behans and blamed the loss on the stopover in Calgary. Berkman stated in his dispatch, "I know I'm beaten in the Great Trans-Canada Hike, but I'm going to finish it out, and believe me, I'll make better time in the home stretch than any of the other hikers." And in that, he was right. He completed the walk from Field to Vancouver, over 500 kilometers in 12 days. That same distance had taken the Behans 14 days and the Dills 16 days. On June 14th at 5:30 p.m., the Dills walked into Vancouver. A few days later, Berkman walked into the city. The great hike across Canada was over. But was there a clear winner? Well, it's hard to tell. The Behans clearly finished first, but then things get a bit murky because the Dills crossed the country the quickest. Their journey took only 134 days, 4 days faster than the Behans and 6 days faster than Berkman. Using this rationale, the Halifax Herald declared that the Dills were the winners. But what happened after the race was done? In Vancouver, the Behans, Dills, and Berkman were honored with a large reception, and a group photo was taken to commemorate the event. And even though Jenny Dill was the one who pushed to finish the race faster than anyone else, the Halifax Herald made sure to downplay her accomplishment. It stated, "No one should get this impression from this race that woman is better than man. Nature contradicts that assumption in spite of the exception." Now that the race was over, almost immediately all 5 vanished from the news. To put it mildly, no one cared about them anymore. All of them spent more than they earned in postcard sales. The Dills had spent at least $500 or $8,500 today and made only a fraction back in sales. Berkman made his way across the country in the hopes he could now walk around the world with his friend, Fred Hebley. But just like before, his walking partner left soon after they started, and Berkman continued on alone. According to Berkman, he had a wager with someone who would pay him $20,000 if he completed the worldwide walk and received $25,000 signature along that journey. On the way back east, he spoke in various towns about his walk. Berkman never completed that around the world walk, though. He married Emily Blackenley in 1925, but she died less than a year later. Berkman died in Chicago in 1968. Meanwhile, Frank Dill only lived a short while and died in late 1928. Jenny Dill eventually remarried. She died in Halifax in 1941. Jack and Clifford Behan moved to the United States and lived long lives. In 1956, Jack Behan said of the race, "We came home broke, our family's in debt and we couldn't get work. We had to move to the United States to pay our debts." He died soon after. Clifford Behan spent the rest of his life in obscurity. Unfortunately, I was unable to find out when he passed. So what can we take from the story of the 5 who walked across Canada? They had taken an epic journey and went from obscurity to fame within their first steps towards the West. But when it was done, everyone else moved on, and all the walkers had left were the memories of their journey. Each had their reasons for the walk, and each lived their lives afterwards. But as they walked down the street later in life, those around them never knew what they had done years earlier. The thing is, you never know what others have gone through unless you walk a mile in their shoes. And in the case of the 5 individuals in this story, they inspired a nation, even for a short while. I hope you enjoyed that episode and our look at the walk across Canada. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories. And there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoy this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.